International business people mostly come to China for profits, opportunities, and an exotic experience. But one of them wanted to discover more. A British investor, he has not only learned the Chinese language well, but grasped the skill to translate ancient Chinese poems into English. What's his story, and what can he share with us after publishing 3 books on China? Welcome to The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. Let's meet Tim Clissold, who is author of 3 books about China already, 2 of them being Mr. China and the other Cloud Chamber. He's also director of 2 investment trusts that are listed on the London Stock Exchange. And there's more. If you read his biography, he studied physics and theoretical physics at Cambridge University. So Tim, welcome to The Point. It's great to have you finally. And I have your book here. I have your book, Cloud Chamber. And this title itself is fascinating already because it's so poetic, right? Literally means cloud chamber, 云室. But I understand it's also a physical term. Tell us about it.
Okay, so a cloud chamber is actually a relatively simple apparatus that was invented in the late 1800s, in fact. But then much later on, it was actually used to study elementary particles that stream in from outside the solar system and come through into the atmosphere in the Earth. And the studying of the tracks in the cloud chambers gave Western scientists a new way of looking at the fundamental structure of matter. So I was quite intrigued by that because I think there are certain parallels between the Chinese language and ancient poetry and the most modern science of Western, because there's some the Chinese language to a foreigner, particularly in poetic form of in the medieval times, appears to us to be very, very uncertain and vague, and Western science has always been struggling to find a kind of perfect explanation for everything. So yes, it seems as though they're like the opposite. Exactly. So it seems like they're the exact opposite, but the most modern theories of Western science are all about uncertainty. So the founding principle of quantum physics is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So in the end, we both actually come back to the same idea that you can't really express things in a very, very certain way. And that just intrigued me, these 2 things that came together. And I've tried to sort of draw those together because when it comes to human emotions, which the ancient poets are expressing, I think we can all accept that those can never be expressed with complete precision. No. So it's quite a surprise that in the end, Western science that spent 200 years trying to get great precision actually can't get great precision in the end either.
That's just that's just like
I'm sure it sounds like So what I'm really trying to do with this book is to illustrate that actually there are some really basic things about people wherever they live in different civilizations that are the same. So the emotions that are expressed in some of the poems, the ones that I've chosen, are instantly recognizable to a foreigner. Okay. And that was actually the criterion.
All right. You know, this is so fascinating, and I'm really treasuring it because I'm doing exactly what I think I'm doing exactly what you're trying to do, is to help people in other culture understand Chinese culture. And I find it very difficult because sometimes it's just intranslatable, if you know what I mean. You know, you can translate the word literally, but you can't translate the picture, the imagination, the scenario, the feelings, and there's just so much of it, right?
So what my personal experience, I lived in China for more than 20 years. And when I came back to the UK, my children could not continue their studies about China in the education system in the UK. And that to me seems like a really serious problem, because the world is going through incredible changes where there's a huge shift. It's an inevitable shift of wealth and power and confidence from the West to the East, and we have to learn how to live together.
Yes.
So I felt that there was, you know, tremendous lack of understanding about China, particularly in the UK, and that worried me, because there are two things about that. So in a nutshell, I think that generally, especially the leadership, Chinese people understand more about us than we understand about the Chinese, right? So from the foreigner's perspective, that's a problem, because it gives Chinese a competitive advantage in this process. It's actually a problem for the Chinese people as well, because if foreigners don't understand the real intention and motivations of Chinese people, that's a danger, because they can misjudge an intention. Yeah,
absolutely.
So that's why I'm so passionate about it, because on both sides we have a very, very urgent and pressing need to understand China. So as you know, in the West there are hawks and there are doves. Yes. Okay, so there are some people who think that China is like a terrible threat to us, right? So in Western society, there's only one thing that unites both the doves and the hawks about China, and that is we need to understand it better.
Oh, that's good to know.
That's very good to know. So what I was trying to do was to find poems that express things that are easy for foreigners to understand. So the first thing is that they're so ancient, right? Yes. So the foreigner generally will say, you know, I had no idea that these poems were written 1300 years ago. And then if
aren't you worried that it's useless to study something that's 1300 years old, because
So that is the exact opposite. That was the thing that I found so amazing, because all the poems are about current problems, right? So Liu Zongyuan wrote a poem about the problems of excess logging on the environment, cutting down too many trees. The totally current problem.
Oh my goodness.
Du Fu was a refugee. Yeah. Bai Juyi wrote about tax
internally
evasion.
Displaced. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Sure. But it's still, you know, massive problem for Europe is the refugee problem, and Bai Juyi, and Du Fu spent most of his life displaced.
It's a bit like, the more it changes, the more it doesn't change, right? It's all what people say, under the sun there is nothing new, especially when you have a 5,000, for European culture as well, you have extremely millennia long civilization, so you have experienced all of these, and it's always good to revisit. Yes.
So I think there's a difference, and the difference is in the language, and that's something I find so intriguing about Chinese, because it's a character-based language, obviously, rather than a phonetic. Okay?
Yes.
So if you take the house that I live in is about 850 years old. So there's a document written about this area called the Doomsday Book, which was written in about 1080 or something. Okay, and if I look at that document, I can't understand a word of it. It's totally different, because the phonetic and the sound changes, right? But if you look at a piece of calligraphy, like there's a piece by Huang Tingjian, which is exactly the same age, and it just starts 我见黄河水, right? So you can, I can see the waters of the Yellow River. So you immediately understand something it's written 1,000 years ago.
It's continuous.
Yes, so in other words, you can reach back and feel the thoughts of those people living 1,000 years ago in a way that you can't do that with a phonetic language. I think that's very powerful.
It's you know, it's very interesting that you mentioned this, because even for many Chinese, it gets lost from time to time. And for instance, we forget that our language sometimes are pictures themselves. When people say, you know, oh, the Chinese is so difficult to learn, I say, if a 2-year-old can learn it, you can learn it too. You just have to learn it in the right way. But anyway, we've been talking about, you know, these ideas, and I have this book. We want to show people with examples, because otherwise they don't know what we're talking about. So so this one, we have decided that we will try to illustrate what we talk about, and it's called 卖炭翁, the old man who sells charcoal. And this is a good test of whether what you say just now is true, because you say these ancient wisdom can stand the test of time, Let's try that in just a moment. But let's first try to read a few lines, read maybe one stanza of this poem. It was written by Bai Juyi from the Tang Dynasty. He lived from 772 CE to 846 CE. So that's 1,300, something like that, years ago. Yeah. And it's about an old man who sells charcoal. Do you want to do the Chinese or the English half?
Why don't maybe you should do the Chinese. I think your Chinese is somewhat better than mine.
Let's try. I mean, you translated this. Your Chinese must be good enough to go through 4 lines. How about that?
Okay. 卖炭王发现烧炭南山中满脸尘灰烟火色满鬓苍苍失纸黑
The old man who sells charcoal, cuts firewood, burns it up on Southern Hill. Grimmed with ash, face streaked with smoke from the fire, his grey hair grizzled, each finger inking black. What living can he make from this miserable fuel? The clothes on his back, the food in his mouth, so wretched, his coat so thin, yet anxious his fuel might lose value, he longs for icy weather. How was it? It was okay?
Excellent.
Thank you. Yours too. Thank you. You managed to translate these 4 lines into these simple languages, but you explained almost to the point as precisely as possible, if I put it correctly.
So for me, this poem and the rest of it too conjures up an image, very strong visual image of a very poor man. So there's a lot of colour in him, all of it black because the charcoal's the important thing. And this man's terribly poor, yet even though he's poor and his clothes are freezing cold, and later on he sits down in some slush by the southern gate, melted snow because he's so exhausted. Even though he's in this pitiful state, he still wants the weather to be colder because that means the price of his fuel will go up. So he's so desperate that he'll bear the pain of the ice. And that to me is not only very visual, but it's also something that tells me that Bai Juyi understood the relationship between supply, demand, and price. Centuries before, centuries before it was articulated in the West, and I think that that's quite interesting as well.
And the harshness and the to me, what strikes me is the emotional part. Being a woman, probably the difference between a physicist and investment. And me as a woman and a mother, I just feel the emotions, the empathy he shares as a poet. He must not live a very bad life if he's able to, observe people and write poems. But yet, what he's trying to describe is the life of this old man who is really shivering, but still wishing for even icier weather.
Yes.
And how yes.
Well, the thing that I particularly like about Bai Juyi is his simplicity of writing, but the fact that he came from a fairly poor family. So he will have known hardship. His father died when he was quite young. He will have known hardship. And then he became very successful, and he was a ginger at the exams and a fairly high-level official and so on. Yes. But he never forgot the condition of the ordinary people. And that to me is tremendously important.
I mean, I think that's the charm of many of these poems, many of these poets, that they're not just writing about beautiful scenery, about life being good, about, spring. They're writing about the grassroots, ordinary people's life. But one thing that strikes me here is also, because in poems you have certain rules. For instance, you have to rhyme, or you have to
Yeah.
alliterate, right? In English poems, for instance, you have alliteration, if I remember correctly. But here, how do you reconcile the content
Yeah.
and the style between the Chinese poems and the English poems?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's very problematic because the Chinese language is much more information dense. Okay. So for example, just one example is 宿舍的舍. Yeah. That if you translate that into English, it's
Which
to
one?
stand on a chariot. Yeah, it's to stand on a
Oh.
chariot and salute. Right, but you can't write stand on a chariot and salute in one line. You can't get the information into one line. So you have to cut some information. So that involves decisions about cutting information but keeping the main feelings. But I think one of the things that's most important about Chinese, this particular genre of Chinese poetry, is the rhythm. So it's very, very fixed rhythm. So you've got this wild imprecision of the real meaning, but it's captured within quite a rigid structure. So
extremely rigid.
So you know, if you have a five characters, you know, it's 1 2 1 2 3. 国破山河在，城春草木深. So very, very rigid rhythm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I tried to convey the rhythm. And then if you can get it to rhyme as well, obviously that's fantastic. So out of the 70 poems I translated, I only got one to have the rhythm and the rhyme. It's very, very difficult.
Oh
Yeah.
my. Oh my.
So basically what I put first of all is the emotional connection, and then the rhythm, and then if you can get some of the rhyme as well, that's a big bonus, but it's very, very difficult.
It's extremely but you know, again, for someone who dares to take up this endeavor and manages, because it's difficult to learn Chinese. Let me tell you this. I was reading a survey about what African people view as their preferred language to learn as a second language, especially for young people. You know, how many % prefer Chinese? Just take a wild guess.
Right. So
In comparison,
I would say quite a lot.
In comparison to English.
Yeah.
What would you guess?
So I went to Egypt recently, and all the young hustlers, all the people outside the temples wanting to sell things, they all speak Chinese.
Yeah, but they're the ones who want to cater to the Chinese tourists.
Yes, of course. No, but the point is such an interesting change, because I went to Egypt 20 years ago and everybody spoke English there. Now they speak Chinese. That's a very important signal about the way the world is thinking.
Well, if that is progress, I tell you, we have a very long way to go, because the statistics that I got was 3%.
Really? Yeah.
3% surveyed across 34 African countries. And I wonder, why. Tim, can you share with them some tips as to where to start, how to start? Because you started in your adult life, I'm sure, and you managed.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
How?
So So I firmly believe, and I hope I've done this with my own children, that you can only be good at something if you really love it.
Yes.
You know, you force yourself to do something like study, I don't know, accountancy or something, because you'll get a better career later on. But if you don't love it, you're never going to be very good at it.
Absolutely.
So for me, personally, my interest was the characters. So every time I saw a character, I wanted to know what it meant. So I think that you have to put the language into the context. So I mean, Chinese history should be very, very interesting to a foreigner, because it's so wild. It's so incredible ups and downs and struggles, and it's very, very
That's the first time I hear the word wild being used to describe Chinese history. Okay, I like that.
No, tremendous battles and struggles going on, going over millennia.
True.
Yeah, and the rise and fall of dynasties, but the same core still surviving. Totally different from our civilization. So our history is one civilization rising and then being replaced with another one. Right. So China's is rising and falling, being replaced by the same civilization.
By itself.
Yeah. but yeah, by itself, yeah. And I think that the thread that runs through it is the written language, because the characters don't change, whereas our language in writing changes. So if you have another civilization comes along, then everything that was written by the civilization is finished.
So what is the key to entering this world of the Chinese characters? How did you start?
Right. So it was complete accident for me, because I went to Hong Kong in 1987, and I had absolutely no idea about anything to do with China at all. Absolutely no idea. And I suddenly saw these characters, and I thought, there's like this completely different way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Everything's totally different. And then I started reading. So if you read history about about what happened to China in the 1800s, for example. It's really important for foreigners to understand that, because you can't understand China's current situation unless you know its recent history. So I found that. So I found like peeling off the onion skins in my own language, trying to understand why China was like it is. That to me led me to the language, because I thought, right, I want to know about this place and its history and its people. And the only way I'm going to be able to do that is if I can try and prise open the language. And there are some things, remember, that are very easy about Chinese language.
For instance?
Right? So there are no tenses. There are no possessives. There's no genders. There's there's no definite article or indefinite article. Actually, it's just like this big string of beautiful pictures. Yeah. So the things that are difficult are the tones. There's so many homophones.
Right.
So the tones and learning the characters. But one thing that I think is really makes it easier is if you go into the countryside, and you just say
use your hands.
But if you just say the simplest thing like ni hao, then people will say, wow, ni de zhongwen na me hao. So you get this positive feedback, because it's quite whereas I think if a Chinese comes to the UK and speaks quite good English, they'll never get this positive emotional feedback. So that's also quite rewarding.
Tim, I say to people, China is how you treat it.
Yeah.
China is how you treat it. But I do want to ask you, you study so many Chinese culture, poems. Is there anything that you think is not so good, that needs to evolve with the time, with the Chinese culture? Because, thousands of years, okay, very rich, very long, but things change after all. Have you ever thought about, is there anything about this Chinese culture that maybe needs to change or modernize a little bit so that we can catch up? If I don't ask for this outfit, I don't have it. Not many people are wearing it these days.
So when I first went to China in the 1980s, I sometimes thought that China wasn't completely open to new ideas. And that for any civilization is kind of the end of a cycle. That's partly the reason why I'm so worried about, some of the Western thinking. There's kind of a certainty in the West that our system is just the best there is and there's nothing that we can learn, which is clearly not the case. So I think earlier on, but not now, because the core, the core of the Chinese reform process is actually taking ideas from other places and then seeing if they work in a Chinese context and experimenting. And then if it doesn't work, you quietly stop doing it without any particular announcement. Yeah. If it does work, you carry on and you explore it. So to me, there isn't anything that stands out, because I think what we have to do is try to form some sort of model where you think more globally about the problems that we face as a species. Without abandoning our differences, but being more open-minded to learn differences between each other.
Yes.
There honestly isn't anything that instantly springs to mind. Look, there are all sorts of differences, right? We can argue about all sorts of difficult political topics, Yes. But I think that the core the core difference is, I think China is very practical. foreigners are more principle driven, and it's quite difficult to negotiate with someone if they're sticking to a set of principles. And I actually think that comes right back to the very beginning. So if you think of the core text of China and the core text of the West, you could argue what it would be, but you can say the core text in China is Lun Yu, the Analects of Confucius.
The Analects, yes.
The first lines are like, you know, 有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎, yeah? So what a pleasure it is to have friends from afar, right? It's just something that every human being can understand. Whereas, you know, if you take the Western text, probably the Bible, yeah, you know, you can argue about what it would be, but that immediately starts with, you know, God creating the world and creating light, you know, bang, and everything's created. So it sets up a relationship between people and a deity in a different way.
In a different way, yeah. The Chinese philosophy and the Western philosophy definitely are different, but I think we definitely can both learn from each other and get better at the same time. And I think that's the richness of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I fully agree. Fully agree.
So it's really great what you're doing, and I hope you will carry on doing that. My last question may be, if I want to ask you to choose one favorite line of poetry from your book, what would it be besides the Bai Ju poem, or one that is the most challenging? The one that you like the most?
Right, so okay, so it's quite, that's a very difficult question, but there's one line that I deliberately mistranslated actually, and it's a
really?
Du Fu line.
Why?
Yeah. Right, so because I wanted to get the real feeling, feeling rather than the words. Okay, so it's in Lu Ye Shu Huai.
Which one?
So,
which page?
It's 305. Okay, so yeah, it finishes at 明期文章中，光阴老兵修，飘飘何所似，天地一沙偶。And so the last line, 天地一沙偶, which literally means I'm just like a single gull between heaven and earth. So it's Du Fu, possibly the greatest poet who ever lived.
Of course.
Worrying about whether he's had anything that is left after he dies. Yeah. So he's got this image of a small bird between the sky and the earth, but I translated it slightly different, which is my whole life just bird tracks on sand. And I did that because sand is an image for Westerners about the passing of time and nothing being left. So there's a very famous poem called Ozymandias, which uses the image of a desert to just say that, yeah, the tininess of an individual life, like one grain of sand in a huge desert. So that's why but it's the idea of Du Fu, this incredible genius thinking about after he died, you know, he retired, and then, you know, what am I? I'm just floating around nothing.
Wow. Have my poems not given me a name in this world, though I retire as I should, now I'm old, floating, like what? I don't know, my whole life just bird tracks on sand. Yeah, that is pretty powerful stuff.
Very powerful.
From 8th century. 8th century. Thank you so much, Tim. Tim Clissold, author of Mr. China, Cloud Chamber, and one other book about China, who's also director of 2 investment trusts that are listed in the London Stock Exchange. It's a great pleasure to have you on our show. Thank you. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching, and you've got the point.